Okay, let's get started. And I have copies of the handouts for today, so we can do that, and then tomorrow do a little bit more. Let me take a sip. Me. You. Us. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Foundational Cultural Competency Training. So today we are going to start with the very basic understanding of cultural competency. Many of you have maybe already participated in some of the other trainings that are offered at Lane Community College. This is the one that hopefully sets that foundation so that we can build on the others. However, if you've already seen some of the others, this might just help clarify some things. So let's get started. We have a few goals for today. One is to increase the knowledge of key cultural concepts, and some of you may be here just for a review. That's fine as well. We would like for Lane Community College to all have a shared understanding and vocabulary before we move forward. In the field of intercultural communication and cultural competency and race relations, there are similar concepts in different fields, and we just want to make sure that Lane Community College, when we're discussing different things, that we're all talking about the same thing. And lastly, we just begin, because this is definitely some of the things that we've been doing in other podcasts, is to begin to define the problems that are cultural conflicts based on interpersonal challenges or systemic challenges. Any questions about the goals for today? Okay, let's get started. So my basic philosophy, or the way that I have framed every intercultural class that I have ever taught, any way that I kind of view the world, is that there are four different things at play. One is each one of us is an individual. I am my cultures. That includes everything that I tell myself, everything that I was normed on in my family, the kind of work I chose and the kind of people who are around me at work, and what my society tells me. At the same time that I'm learning about me, people who are different than me in varying degrees are getting very different tapes often. They're learning about themselves. Their families may have different norms, values, ideas. Their work culture or their position in the work may also give them a very different view of the world and where our standing is in our society, or if we are from a different society. I strongly believe that we need to know who we are culturally, and we need to take some time, step back and listen quietly to them and understand those people who are different than us before we get into any kind of relationship together. If we do that, I cannot guarantee there will not be conflict. There will still be conflict, but we will have more tools to understand the two key players. And it is no longer, I win and I know it because you lose. I've actually taken some time to get to know you and I like you. I want to win, of course, we all do when we're in conflict, but not at your cost. I have a higher desire to make sure that this feels fair to all of us. And lastly, the part that is bigger than us is the systemic, and having a chance to understand what we're talking about when we talk about cultural competency, when we talk about systemic oppression, that's bigger than just that one conversation that we're having with somebody at the water cooler. So let's start out with our own culture. We're going to spend just some time on understanding who we are culturally. Often for people of color or marginalized people, we've done a lot of study about this. And I was just reading an article today where he said, so what culture is yours? And majority of white people would say, well, I just never think about that. There's no real need to, there's no conflict about it. You're the norm. Many of us who come from other cultures, we know and we're hyper aware of it. So let's all try to start out on the same footing and understand a little bit about who we are. Next. So when I say culture, there are actually approximately 14 different cultural categories. These are not cultures. These are the categories under which we talk when we are talking about culture. And when you're looking at this, what you might see is some of these cultures are more acceptable to talk about than others. Some of these cultures are, when we talk about these things, it might bring a smile to somebody, or it might bring curiosity. Some of these cultural categories, when we talk about them, it causes discomfort. People have fear about it. There's more bias about some of these than others. Also, some of these are visible and some of these are invisible. So there's a question of when we disclose and when we don't. So before we go to the next one, I want to do some introductions, and I'd like for you to start thinking about those cultural categories and a few of the ones that are part of you. And what I'd like to do is just go around the room, and if people can tell us their name and the department that they're in, and then 2 or 3 of the cultures that you belong to. Now, again, before I do this, you don't say religion is one of my cultures. That is a cultural category. If that's the one you pick to use as your introduction, you say, for example, for me, I'm a practicing Catholic. And I want to say something that makes that easy, something that makes that hard. So the introduction says your name, what department, 2 or 3 of these cultures under those cultural categories, and maybe a reason why you love being there, what makes it difficult, what makes it challenging. Again, a little bit of a time limit, probably 2 to 3 minutes per person. And as all of you, because your teachers know that good modeling is one of the best ways to give the instructions, so I'm gonna go first. So my name is Frances Portillo, Portillo Consulting International, and I've been doing this work since I started walking and talking. So I have a whole bunch of this figured out, and I want to start out with my age. I am 65 years old, and I think it's great. I love the idea that I might actually know a little bit more. When you were little and they said you have to be this tall to ride the ride, well, now all of a sudden I get the senior menu and I get Medicare, so I feel like I got back up to that. I feel like anybody who doesn't disclose their age is buying into the age discrimination by saying, I don't want to tell you. So I'm very actually proud of my age, and I like living it. Another one I would pick is family. I am a proud nana of 2, 4, 7 grandchildren, and I love each one of them very much. The family, though, for me, the surprise is that I've never had children. So these are all step-grandchildren, and yet I wouldn't see them that way. When I think of myself as a nana, as a grandmother in Spanish, it is my family. There's no step about it. And truth be told, I'm probably the most active grandmother in the whole of all of us grandparents. And last but not least, geographic, I'll just say that I am a proud Oregonian, but I'm also very happy that I am from Arizona State University, and I went from Arizona to Oregon, and sometimes I feel like I'm bicultural, and I'm happiest in an airplane between the two. So that's me, gave you a couple of ideas of where to go. Who would like to go first? Don't all of you raise your hand at once. Thank you, Philip. Oh, it was Amanda. Amanda, go.
Sure. So, gosh, well, you did age, but I can just throw that out there because now I'm like, well, I want to tell everybody. I am 34. What's interesting for me is that with family, is that I live with my parents. I have done this twice now as an adult, and they are perfectly happy to welcome me back in. They have always been a safety net for me in a way, and they have done nothing but support me when I needed them most. So I'm an only child, and so our family unit is very, very tight-knit, and that includes that home is always home with my parents. I guess I could go with, we'll do gender next. I would be cisgender female, which means I was born a female, and I live and breathe being a female. What else? How about education? That's really important to me. I've spent a good amount of time involved with education. I have a master's degree in art business, and I have 3 undergraduate degrees. history, art history, and French, and a handful of minors because I'm just insatiably curious about stuff, and I definitely want to get my PhD. So education for me is about open-mindedness. It's about continual learning, whether that be personal learning or cultural learning, worldview learning, and it has taken me all over the world and country and have met some incredible people because of that. Is that 2 to 3, I think?
Thank you. Phil, I was putting you on the spot before. I think I'll just continue to do that. Go ahead. Unmute first.
Hi, I'm Phil Tajitsu Nash. I love how you have these categories here because I'm trying to think of the various ways that I and other people introduce themselves. As a person of third generation Japanese American ancestry on my mom's side and 13th generation European immigrant on my dad's side, I usually start by getting into the race, ethnicity, you know, that whole realm of discussion very quickly. And, you know, there's absolutely no reason why I can't say I'm a cis male or talk about the political work I've done, but I'm happy to see that you've got all these things up here. Geographically, I am an East Coast person. I was born in New York, raised in New Jersey, and have lived in many places. I'm currently living in the DC area. I'm trained as a lawyer by profession and an urban planner, but I am currently doing work that relates to ethnic studies and a bunch of other things. So I don't want to go over my time, but glad to be here.
Thank you. Greg, Tracy, who's going first?
Doesn't make any difference to me. You want me to hop in?
Yes, please. I like the idea of having some of these so they can have examples.
Okay. My name is Craig Evans. I'm Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Lane Community College. I'm 59 years old, and I've earned every gray hair that I've got. Family-wise, I have 5 children. I'm African American. My wife is white. So we have what most people consider a mixed race family. I like to consider it a multicultural family because different influences come into my family over the years, and you know, originally from, you know, my ancestors, my parents and grandparents. I have that perspective of the world. I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, which is the Midwest. And I have one granddaughter who lives in Georgia with her dad and her mom. And they're getting married here next year. It's like we've got 2 weddings coming up. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Greg. And last but not least, Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy.
Did you hear me?
Perfectly.
Did I come through?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Hi, my name is Tracy. In terms of family, I'm a single mom of 2 adult sons. I am a pagan. I am a first-generation college student, first person in my family to have any degree, and I just entered grad school. I have an 8th grade education, some associate's degrees, a bachelor's, and now I'm in grad school. Good times. Working that GED, right? Let's see, I am disabled. I have a chronic illness, which impacts my daily life. And I am a left coaster.
Thank you so much. I want to take a moment and just look at the richness in this room. And thank you, Phil, for saying that too, about we start out with one of the ones that's obvious, and you don't really get to see the rest of who I am if I don't get to talk about all of my cultures. And I would also add that sometimes one culture is more dominant than the other. Right now, in current times, there's a lot of talk, and race is probably a dominant culture for many of us. If when I go to work, if I have a stressful week, that might be my dominant culture. And maybe I'm working on a project at work and I'm really, really thinking to myself as part of my profession. And all of a sudden the phone rings and they say, your son had an accident, you have to go to the hospital. Family becomes my dominant culture. And I would even say that the 3 or 4 that you chose to talk about today might be totally different in a different context. So these are part of who we are. And I'd like to challenge you to think about introducing yourself without using any of these categories, because, next slide, often what I hear is that people say, well, those are boxes. Don't put me in boxes, as if there's something wrong with my cultures. What happens is that, as I said, try to introduce yourself without any of those categories. It's impossible, but we somehow assume that a box means that I can't get out, or that I'm stuck inside something, or that that's the only thing you will see about me. And then we start defining our own identity. I am all of those things that I introduced myself with. You are all of those things that you introduced yourselves with. And I'd like us to reframe this. Instead of thinking about these as boxes, that we start using Clifford Geertz's model. Clifford Geertz, it's a seminal work. It was called The Interpretation of Cultures. I don't believe you could get out of 101 intercultural communication without reading his book. I, on the other hand, will summarize the whole book for you using non-gender specific language, because this book was written many, many years ago. But basically his treatise on this, all humans are animals suspended in webs of significance they themselves have spun. Culture is that web. The other metaphor for me was that my cultures are more like a blanket than a box. They're the things that I get into and I feel comfortable. They're those groups that when I walk in, I don't have to monitor my talking. I want to tell you a story, but I don't have to give you all the backstory because you're part of who I am. And so my cultures are those webs that are significant to me. And some people say, but isn't a web restricting? Well, it is if I don't grow. But look at all the places on that web where I can grow new places. Again, another mixing metaphors could be a roadmap. This is what tells me what keeps me safe. It tells me what will make me happy. It tells me how I make other people happy. It gives me the rules that I need to participate in my culture. So again, the other 2 pictures, a warm blanket that takes care of me. It tells me when I'm safe, or instead of us being inside the box, that the box goes with us everywhere and helps us understand who we are. Questions, comments? Okay, moving on. When I asked you to say 3 or 4 of your cultures, we were talking about not one specific one, but the fact that we are not just our race or our age or our gender. We have many places where these intersect. And again, the concept of intersectionality recognizes that we belong to more than one social category simultaneously. And in one culture, I may feel very privileged, while in another one, I feel at a disadvantage. And so looking at all of the places where we can intersect, or when we're in a group of women who want to talk about discrimination towards women, but all of the women in the room are white, it might make me think about my ethnicity and how those 2 intersect in how I'm talking. a very simple and easy one that I think about. When I said I went to Arizona State. We used to be pretty good in football. When we went to the game, we were all dressed in maroon and gold pom-poms, little devil ears, devil horns, big sweatshirts. My dominant culture at that point was my education sports culture. And not one of us ever looked around and thought, gee, you're different than us. We all felt like we were united in beating that other team. If one person in that group on that sports bus had made a comment about my gender or my age or my race, my dominant culture might have become social justice fighter, my ethnic group, one of the others. So intersectionality is where we work together, but it's also how our dominant cultures come differently based on our experiences. And you can kind of illustrate it by this next slide. And we were just playing with crossword puzzles and where they intersect. And one day, my sports hobbies, leisure culture is intersecting with my sexual orientation because I'm reading all about sports and gender and whether or not women can play on the team, etc. And then another day, I may not be thinking about those at all. It might be education and my abilities. So again, intersectionality occurs for all of us at different times in the same day. Questions, comments about this? Moving on. So the first handout that you have, just stopping and thinking about our own culture, are these questions. And again, I'll give you some time to think about it and react to it, but just understanding ourselves before we are able to listen to other people, we need to figure out who we are in that cultural sense. So what in my world made me view myself or my cultures as good? And I'm thinking about the stories that you learned at your grandparents' knee, the books that you read or the television shows that you went to, interacting with other children. What made you say, mine's good? Who are other people who look and act and think and believe like me? Who were your role models? Who were the people who were speaking? Who were the people who you invited to your birthday party, for example, because they acted and looked like you? What maybe were the messages that you got that said it was good to be you or bad to be you about being in your own culture? I am still reminded of the time that our band teacher, wanting to be very multicultural, decided that he would have us play La Marcha de Zacatecas. Now, in the United States, we tend to wear our university sweatshirts. Well, in Mexico, it's all about your state and your state pride. And Zacatecas is the place where my grandfather was born. And we started playing La Marcha de Zacatecas. And my grandfather stood up and started clapping along to the song. And somehow I had already gotten the message that there was something wrong with being Mexican. And when he stood up, and by the way, any of you, if your grandparents stood up and started clapping along, would probably be embarrassed. But at that moment, the tape that was in my head was, I hate being Mexican. That somehow the message that was coming to me was that there was something wrong with my ethnicity. So how do I go back and recover and find the good roadmap signs, the blankets that say being a Mexican is a good thing, going home and eating those freshly made tortillas and beans that my nana made? Where are my guides? So I've given you a couple of examples. I encourage you to turn the video off and think about it, but I'm gonna ask the people who are in the room right now, did you think of any stories about your roadmap, your blankets? What were some things that came up for you? Maybe we could have one or two people tell a story.
Yeah, Francis, you made me think about when I was younger, having both a Japanese American parent and a European American parent. I was thinking about these issues all the time. It's funny, when I heard the word intersectionality, a lot of things fell into place. But basically, you know, it wasn't just a matter of, you know, do we eat with chopsticks today or a fork? There were 100 ways in which the notion of normal was challenged every single day. So when my grandmother was there, we would sometimes speak Japanese at home. My parents are both multilingual, so sometimes they would teach me other languages as well. So I was taught by them to think of myself as being somebody in between things, which I guess is good because I ended up, you know, having an okay life after that. But I think sometimes that indeterminacy creates a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of, you know, wondering, you know, to answer your question, you know, what in my world made me think of myself as good? I'm not sure. I mean, it was one of those things. I'm not sure which one.
And perhaps it's kind of on a continuum, or at one point, that's really good and I can use it right now. And at another point, that's one more piece that hurts. Yeah. One more?
I have something to add. I wouldn't really say it's something that made me think it was my culture was good. It's actually the opposite, that the culture I was raised in was bad. It was when I discovered that my mother was racist. And I discovered that when an African-American boy came to the door for me, and she used a really, really bad term to refer to him. And I was just shocked. I had not realized that I had been raised by a racist, and I just had to kind of sit with that. And even talking about it gets me all choked up. And it was just a really, I think I was like 12. Okay, so it kind of took me a while to realize, right, that it was like, ooh, this is bad. But realizing that, ooh, this is bad was, you know, it was a turning point, a catalyst in my life.
Thank you. That's really one of those ahas about your parents that is painful. Yeah, thank you. So again, I encourage you, write it out, or even just think about this as you go along in your day after this workshop. Just, oh, that's a tape that told me my culture was good. Oh, there's a tape that told me it was bad. I think once we have this in the forefront, we end up starting to think about it a lot more. So thank you. So we spent a little bit of time talking about my culture, looking at ourselves introspectively. Now I want to look at other people who had very different experiences than you. And what happens is that we tend to have trouble listening and listening to understand, as opposed to listening to say, oh yeah, that's what I had, or listening to find out when you're going to argue with them, but really listening with the humility that says, I don't know their story. I didn't walk in their shoes. Being able to listen and not say, if I were them, I would have. When I hear the phrase, well, you have to walk a mile in my shoes, you're also bringing all your cultures with you. And your feet may be a different size, and maybe you have comfy socks. So really, let's all understand that we don't know what it's like to be the opposite of all those cultures that we had. And let's listen so that we can understand. And so this is a little bit of understanding who in your world gives you the information that you don't have about their cultures. So I put my in that big blue because this represents all the people who are really close to you. These are your closest friends, your closest family. These are the people who you spend the most time with. These are your blanket people. These are the people that when you're with them, you can just go, okay, I get to be me. That next layer, that white layer there, may be people you work with, people who come over occasionally, the family members of people who you are close to. The yellow layer could be people at work, people you see irregularly, but you do have some interaction. And the green is people you know nothing about. So next slide will show you what you do with this. So that green dot says people who are like me. And are they in the blue dot, the white dot, the yellow dot, or the green dot? And so for example, I'm thinking of one of my friends, not family, but she and I both are social justice workers. We're both about the same age. We tend to be able to finish each other's sentences. And if you looked at those 14 cultural categories, we have a lot of them in common. And I spend a lot of time with her. So she's people like me. She's probably that dot for that person specifically goes in that blue area. People of different ethnic or racial groups. Jeepers, I'm thinking about, let me just start internationally. We have had people in our backyard who are from Indonesia, who are from Brazil, who are from Mexico and Colombia. All 4 of those families I could put in that blue circle. Okay. On the other hand, I might think of one colleague I work with who practices the religion of Islam, Islamic woman. And maybe I don't really see her often. She's more of a work person. So I might put her blue dot in the white or the yellow part. Many of you have seen, if you haven't, I encourage you to see the presentation that I did with my colleague Mads on gender diversity. And I feel like we are really, really close. I might put Mads in the blue circle or the white circle. So you get the idea of, in your blue circle there, how many people from different cultures, how many people who are very different than you are close enough to be able to tell you about them? They're close enough, the concept is culture broker, who could tell you about their culture at a deeper level because you have them in your circle. And I want to encourage you on this, if you're feeling a little bit like, well, I don't have that many. A colleague of mine did this a little bit differently. She asked everybody to take out their cell phones and look at their addresses and their list of people that were in there. She was an African-American single mom who was co-presenting with me. And she said, I took my phone book out and realized that most of my friends are African-American single moms. And even though I'm teaching this, I'm not living it. This is a way to understand how close are you to others in a way that they can help you understand them. Did anybody come to mind? Did you think of anybody or where they might be on this circle? Comments? Yeah, leave me hanging there, guys. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for those comments. No, thanks, Phil.
It's interesting. I'm thinking of 2 words, mishpucha in Yiddish and ohana in Hawaiian, which very much capture some of this thought, because we tend to think of family meaning bio-family, people who gave birth to us and are genetically related to us. But I think the mishpucha and ohana concepts look at the families that we put together, the people who we want to be around us. And I like the way that you've got that big blue my category there, where you could put in somebody who might be a different religion, who might be a different gender, might be a different job or profession. These are all people you hold close, you hold them dear, but they're not exactly like you. And I think I personally strive to have that circle be as big as possible. But like you say, when you actually look at your Facebook page, look at your phone book or whatever, there are times where there are more people. I would say there are more Asian Americans than others in my group. There's actually quite a few multiracial people because I've tended to aggregate that group. But on the other hand, because of my social justice work, I've got a pretty diverse group of people of all backgrounds, speaking a lot of languages, living in a lot of places. So sometimes you do it intentionally and sometimes it just happens. But I like the way you've got that circle there. I think it's really good.
And just being able to look at it every once in a while. And when we start to make these broad brush strokes about other people and saying, well, where did I get that information? And maybe we really don't have anybody in our world that would have that, who would provide us with information that's actually useful. Greg, were you going to say something? I see your microphone's on.
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in right away, but I had to think about this for a minute and think about kind of the paradigm shifts that I've gone through in my life. So when I was a kid and growing up and going to school K-12, my total social circle was all African American. Same thing in the neighborhood, all of that, except for the work that my mother did in civil rights and social justice outside of the neighborhood, inside of the neighborhood, but also outside of the neighborhood. So then I had another group of friends or associates that were white, that were Jewish, Italian, that, you know, I interacted with as a result of my mother's activities. And so that circle started, there's more people that started getting into the blue area for my circle than, you know, being out on the outer edges. So that's the way I kind of look at it from that particular perspective, is that you know, the relationships and associations that I've had over the years have just kind of grown and expanded from a cultural point of view, and I really hadn't thought about that before. So, you know, thanks for bringing it up this way. You know, I really appreciate that, because it took me a minute to think about it.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I was thinking about a young woman. Again, I'm giving you all sorts of clues when I describe them. A young woman who has a job of working in the small little grocery market on the corner, and she pretty much, I don't think she even had a car. So she's pretty much, this is her community. And I walk in and she commented about the political race, the presidential race, and she said, well, so-and-so is going to win. And I said, are you sure of that? And she said, yes. And I said, I think the other guy's going to win. And she goes, well, nobody I know voted for him. And so again, she only sees things within her blue circle, and her blue circle only has people who think like her politically. She really wasn't able to see it. Now, I'm all over the country. I'm traveling. I'm listening. I had a bigger, wider understanding of what was going on politically in the country because my circle was bigger. It helps us make better informed decisions the more people we have who we can use as our culture brokers, who they trust us and we trust them. Next. So again, just to finish this part up, who are they? When we read a story or we hear something in the paper or something about them, before we make a comment, perhaps we should say, how do I know them? Where do they line up on my circles? And where did my story come from? Is there anyone besides Amanda who can explain this little cartoon we have here? I'm not a hippopotamus, I'm a moomin. Anybody know the origins of this? Well, I could say anybody want to take a stab at it, but we've already said you don't want to guess if this isn't part of your world. So again, he does look like a hippopotamus. And if I'm not from that culture, I could look at it and say, well, I think that's a hippopotamus. Based on all of my cultural understanding, that's my conclusion. Actually, this is from a Finnish children's writer who, these are his characters, and he has these characters called moomins. And yeah, it looks like a hippopotamus to us on the outside, and we don't have that kind of thing in our culture. We don't understand this moomin, and so we start guessing. And pretty soon we start generalizing to other things about Finnish people, unless we say, gee, I never knew. I have no children's books from Finland. Look at all the things I'm missing. And as we get closer, and it also tells us we don't really have any Finnish friends, do we? Amanda does. So the moral of the story, next slide. Also, what we're looking at is the surface. When the further away our culture brokers are from our internal blue circle, the more we're going to guess based on what we see at the top of the iceberg. So this metaphor, the tip of the iceberg is generally what we see. We have no idea what's going on underneath. So we see words, customs, traditions, what people are wearing, the language that they use, and we make certain assumptions about their beliefs, which we may or may not see, but we really don't know their values, their assumptions, or their thought processes. But we make assumptions about it. I remember one time a boss of mine had to give me some feedback. And a couple days later, I said, just as an interculturalist, the words you use were very direct. It's a very American style. There's other styles when you're working internationally with some of the other colleagues. I'd love to show you how that landed a little bit differently for me. And she looked at me and she goes, oh, you're an American, you grew up here, you're just making that up. Okay. I could speak the words. I understood what they were saying in their language, but what she didn't understand was that underneath that, to my world, she used a cannon when a pea shooter would have worked just fine. To her, it was exactly what she needed to do. So again, just because people can speak our language or look like us or can be at the same event doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with us. That requires them coming closer into our circles. The one, that's fine. I was gonna also say that I think this is a really important point, and I always wanna make sure that I get it in there. There is a tendency to attribute a difference to culture the more different a person is than you. The more they look and act like you, the less likely we will attribute a difference to culture and just think they are wrong. So let's just say that in about a half an hour here, I'm gonna go pick someone up. They are from Vietnam, they are male, they are an engineer, they are in their 20s. And they make a comment about our political world that is way different than mine, okay? And I say, oh, they're from a different culture, and I'm willing to let that be what it is. These are cultural differences. So I drop this person off, and the next person I pick up is Canadian, 65, female, works in my field. And she makes the same political comment, and instead of thinking, oh, it's a cultural difference, I think, how can you be so dumb? How can you, you're so wrong. I thought you were smarter than that. Because the closer they look like us, talk like us, sound like us, the less likely we are to understand that the bottom of this iceberg is different than ours. And partially what we're talking about, next slide, is stereotypes and generalizations. And we know that stereotypes are bad, that these are often things that we decide what a moomin is, and we think that all children's books in Finland are about these mythical characters. They don't really have any real ones. We do all these stereotypes. We say all Asians are good at math, all Latinos are always late. Those are stereotypes. If they start with the word all, it's probably a good clue that these are stereotypes. When stereotypes are believed to be true, they are not revised even in the face of contradictory evidence. So there's a lot of evidence that Asian kids do really well in math. And I'm sitting here thinking all Asians are good at math. And a little young student comes in and they're having trouble with math. If I am stereotyping, my thought will be, well, one of two things has to be true. You're either lying about being Asian or you're lying about being good at math. That's the stereotype, where with the presence of new information, I still refuse to believe anything else. I don't change it. So next slide, we can see that, yeah, Phil. I can't hear you, you need to unmute.
Hi. So yeah, for Asian Americans, some of that stereotype about math came about in the 60s when there were a lot of people coming in who were very good in math. There were people who were chosen for being very good. We needed people to help with our math and physics and other things because the Russians had put the Sputnik up, and our math and science programs were not that good in this country. And so we needed to have these people. And so a lot of Asians coming in tended to be the top 1% of their country. And what I tell my students sometimes is, imagine I went over to Ethiopia and I took the top 1% of students and brought them over here. Then you'd sit in a math class and go, oh my goodness, there are 3 Ethiopians. There's no chance I'm going to get an A in this class. But that's literally what happened. So the pool of people that people were basing it on was people who were the top learners from that society. There were plenty of people in those countries who were not good in math, not good in other things. But again, that stereotype could sometimes come from a pool of information that's incomplete or inaccurate.
So a better way to say it is, most of the Asian students who came here were from the top 1% of their class in math. A little bit more accurate. So next slide. Thank you, Phil. Phil, that was really food for thought, I think, and how these things come. Stereotypes are harmful. They're bad. We just got to say that out loud. They're used unconsciously or reactively. They're judgmental and they're rigid. No way to get out of it. This is the way it is. They tend to overgeneralize and be very simple. So in Phil's example, it's simple. They're all good in math. We don't have to say anything else. We don't have to give the historical background. We don't have to say, gee, this is what it feels like. I wonder why. We don't ask why. We just say, this is the way it is. They're an attempt to limit and pigeonhole, because now what if the Asian student actually has a gift for literature or a gift for something else? We like to pigeonhole, and they're fixed and not open to revisiting. No, you're just wrong. This is the right way to think. On the other side of that, you have generalizations, and generalizations can be helpful. They're a guide. We use these consciously and analytically. We can be flexible about this, and we're looking for accuracy, which means often we're going to back it by percentages, or we say many. Again, stereotypes usually start with all. Generalizations are many, most, in my experience. All Latinos are Catholic. That's a stereotype. Many Latinos are Catholic. Historically, there have been many Catholics in Latin America. So if I come along and you say, are you Catholic? That's probably a good guess. And in fact, I am. But my friend Sonia, if you said, oh, you're Catholic, right? Because you're Latina, she would say, no. And they'd say, oh, but you converted, right? No, she was born and raised in a Lutheran household in Argentina. So now you have new information. You think, oh, many people in Latin America are Catholic. That's a generalization that will help you understand who they are, how you serve them. But you have to be flexible. That's what makes a generalization. And again, you're looking for similarities and principles, and you're constantly modifying the input. Another thing about generalizations, what may have been true 3 generations ago turns into a stereotype if you keep trying to apply it now. So generalizations have to constantly be modified. And when I hear somebody say, this happened to me the other day, I'm in a training, I'm trying to show some communication discourse patterns between mainstream American, Asian, and Latin culture. And I can't get off the mark because everybody says, you're stereotyping. No, I'm telling you about some generalizations. But if you do not let me be able to talk about generalizations, there is no study of intercultural communication. There is no study of cultural differences. And we have to be able to use these generalizations to understand broad patterns that are part of my web. Next.
Can I just add, the other piece of this model minority thing about Asian Americans being good in math, it also tended to say that the system, as broken as it is still working. And so all of a sudden, if you say, well, these little Asian American boys and girls are in a economically disadvantaged situation, suddenly they come from the greengrocer store or something and go to a top college, maybe the system works. And so in this case, when you look at the stereotype, it hurts, as you say, the Asian American who may be good in literature, who's not good in math. And it also hurts the other African American, Latino, and other kids who may want to have a system that's working better for them, but instead some people in power can say, well, the system's working. There are some little kids here who are able to make it work. So that's a way in which it's not just an interpersonal thing, it's also something that it affects us all on a bigger societal level as well.
And when we talk about systemic racism, I want to come back to that, because statistically, by that tidbit, it should be that more Asians were hired, Asian Americans were hired, and their discrimination towards Asian Americans who had good degrees in math and science and engineering still did not get hired at the rate that would have matched. So even with the stereotype, there was still the systemic oppression. And again, if you could just mark that, because that really does come in a minute. So again, when we say listen to our stories, I do not mean listen to the oppression stories over and over again. I feel that often some well-meaning people want to hear all the times that we had trouble. And what I have been looking for, and I have this collection, and I have some of those books right here, because these are definitely part of my collection. For some reason, I've just got my children's books out. But these books are just an example of books that we write for us that tell pride in our culture. Not all the stories about other people have to be about oppression or misery. A good story will have a conflict, but it doesn't always have to be talking about how we've been put down. And in fact, those are not helpful. What we need to teach our students, what we need to teach our families, what we need to bring in as culture brokers to others is that we are proud of the cultures we're in. We're happy to be part of those. If you have some of these, that's great. Is there, let's pick out 2 or 3 that people say, I've never heard of that story. Can you tell me about it? Just 2 or 3 of these books. Wish I got a kickback for this from the book publishers. See one in there that you don't recognize?
Yeah, Francis, I've never heard of Tar Beach.
Ah,
The Joy Luck Club, yes, and the other ones. But.
Yeah. This is Tar Beach, and it's written by Faith Ringgold, who was also a quilter. And so on each page down at the bottom, it has the quilting. And one of the reasons I like, whoops, where are you going? One of the reasons that I like this book, it's about her vision of flying. And she lives, they party in New York City. The family has parties on the rooftop. And that's where she sees herself flying all over the city, and she loves her family. She loves where she lives. She loves the city. She loves the extended family. So again, really positive. And then it's not just the story, it's the artwork. And Faith Ringgold, I believe, has actually displayed in some of the major museums for her quilting.
She is a prolific African-American artist, and she is one of the most popular currently.
Another one that you don't know or that you're curious about or that you'd like to comment on?
Francis, I love your story that you had about the Proudest Blue. I didn't know what it was earlier, but I've heard you speak about it before, and I love that.
This is one of my brand new ones, and it came from, it was a list of how to talk to your kids about race, 30 children's books. So any that I didn't own, I bought them. That's probably one of my cultures, is collector of children's books from all over the world. So this was wonderful. And I did include some big people books in there too. I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter is a chapter book about looking for her identity as a Mexican and an American. Amy Tan Joy Luck Club. Reign of Gold is the Mexican-American equivalent of Roots. Victor Villaseñor, his 4 Generations. But you asked about the proudest blue, and I told my grandson I had new books. Would you like to read one? He goes, my favorite color is blue. I want to read the proudest blue. And it's about a little girl who gets her first hijab, and her favorite color is blue. And she takes it, and it's told by her sister, her younger sister's point of view. She says, I can't wait till I get my first hijab. And of course she wears it to school, and there's a bully, and somehow she's just too proud of it to let herself be bullied. And I was talking to some librarians, and I said, please don't just put this in the ethnic other culture books. This could be a book about bullying. It could be a book about colors and what emotions you have about these. It could be a book about big sister, little sister. There are so many different cultures in this book. And a couple days later, I bring out my scarf, and my grandson goes, is that your hijab? And the word became part of his vocabulary too, because it's listening to the stories from their point of view gets you to understand them a lot more, and it becomes part of our vocabulary. Thanks for asking, Amanda. You know I love that book. Next. So now we've spent a little bit of time on who we are. We've spent a little bit of time stopping and listening to understand who they are, and then we start to try getting together and talking to each other. And this is what happens when we get together. Sometimes we are hit with implicit bias. Sometimes we are the victims, and sometimes we are the ones who actually say it. This is not about them or us. It's about all of us in this world. So implicit biases are discriminatory biases based on implicit attitudes or stereotypes, which we've already talked about. They're problematic because they can produce behavior that diverges from a person's avowed or endorsed beliefs. I just sat very sadly again with a Latino man telling a story to his team about what it feels like to walk down the street and to see people, particularly white women, running off to the sides. I've heard this called, in African American culture, scatter the pigeons or Moses parting the waters, where there's a black man walking down the street, white woman sees him and just goes, whoops, just remembered I have to cross the street. And a couple of people in the room, as this man was telling his story, said, I think I do that. And they were horrified at themselves because they thought they didn't have bias. And here they were acting on it and not even seeing it. And that's where that last line is. They can produce behavior that diverges. I think I'm not prejudiced, and all of a sudden, look at what happens. Next. Another concept is intent versus impact. I know my language. I know what's funny. I know that you and I, my best friend and I are sitting there. We know what we can get away with. We don't necessarily know that that lands with everybody the same way. I know what I'm trying to say. I don't know what you heard me say. And when the intent and the impact do not match, we have a conflict. I may be trying to say something very nice to you, but I used the wrong words and you heard it very differently. Or let me give you a real life example. We're sitting at dinner with a man I did not know very well. He's from Chicago and he owns a used car company. And he starts talking about his employees and he keeps referring to them as wetbacks. And the more he said it, my husband and I are holding hands underneath, and I thought our fingernails were going to dig into each other's. And it's kind of like, do you want to take him on or do I? And again, what is the impact that has on me? I think he's racist. I start thinking about his used car salesman, and it goes into all the stereotypes that I have about that. And I really want to punch him. But I listened. And what I heard, the intent of his story was to say how mistreated he felt his employees were in other contexts. He felt really close to the people because they worked so hard, and he felt that he could not even give them the level of money that they deserved. And had I reacted to the impact before I had listened to him totally, I might have missed the intent. Goes both ways. Sometimes I'm telling a story. Well, I'll give again an example. I have two friends, Carol and Bessie, both African American. Both are my friends. I make the same comment about a young African American choir to Carol and Bessie. When I say the comment to Carol, she had tears in her eyes saying, I can't believe you understand my culture so well. I'm so glad you're doing this work. I make the same comment to Bessie, and Bessie said, I had no idea you would ever say such a racist thing. I know what I'm trying to say, and I cannot say that the impact will be the same for every single person I tell it to. I did not know my audience in the second one. What my analysis of this is that Carol and I both worked in the intercultural field, and she knew me as probably somebody inside her circle of women of color. Bessie and I work more in the social emotional drug and alcohol prevention. And I think when Bessie heard it, I was maybe in that white or that yellow part of that circle. And what she heard was a person not inside her inner circle of Black women. What I can tell you is that rather than get scared or move away or get embarrassed or not work through this, I stayed with it until we both understood what we were trying to say. The intent and the impact matched. And as a positive thing to all of this, what I can tell you is that I was the first person Bessie called when her husband passed away, because I wasn't afraid of the conflict. We worked through it, not avoiding it. That was a lot. Maybe questions or comments there. Did anybody want to say anything? So this, oh, go ahead, Greg. I see you. So this next slide, again, I developed this as just kind of my brainstorming list of why is it hard to listen during times of conflict? In the case of Carol and Bessie, maybe some of this was going on for Bessie too. Why is it hard to listen during times of conflict? When you are raging at me, I have a hard time. I study this, I teach it, and yet when something is really getting to me, I may not be able to do it right. So during times of conflict, the speaker or the listener may just have really strong opinions or passions, and they can't stop speaking without these broad, large strokes of language and tone and physicality. Sometimes it's hard to understand because we just misunderstand. We don't understand what the term means. We don't understand what they said. We feel misunderstood, we scream louder. Or the stakes are high. If I don't resolve this conflict in a way that works for me, my people will lose out on educational opportunities. We'll go to jail. The stakes are high for at least one of us in this conflict, which leads to fear. I'm just so afraid, whoops, not quite done. I'm so afraid that I cannot hear you, or I'm talking and not listening. Past experiences. Last time I talked to someone who was different from me, this is how they reacted, and I'm sure you're going to react that way too. So let me just argue with you before you even start. Language could mean I'm an immigrant, I don't have the right words, so I get more frustrated and I get louder and I get more enraged. Or language could mean the word you just used is the word that made me not be able to think about it. Let me say the last one and then hold on to that language one because it's our next slide. Last one is just getting it off my chest. Really, I'm not trying to solve a conflict with you. I am so enraged. You're really not my audience. My audience is me just being able to huff and puff and get it out. When there is rage, you've got to wait until that person is willing to listen and to speak in a way that you can both talk. But let's go back to language. There is a concept called hot buttons. And hot buttons, again, this is a self-exercise, are words that when they're said, you can't hear anything else they say after that. And I think when I said that about wetbacks, that's a hot button for me. And this guy said that, and it was really, really close to just butting in and saying, nope, this is why you're wrong before they even finish their sentence. Okay? A big hot button for me is calm down. Latino culture, African American culture, we are passionate people. We explain things through our hands, through our voice. And so when a mainstream person tells me to calm down, it feels like the impact it has on me is I don't value the level of feeling that you have right now. And the minute I hear calm down or breathe, I have trouble going on. I know that it's a hot button. When I can say that here, it will make it easier next time that happens to go, whoa, that's my hot button. If I really want to resolve this conflict, I need to know that about me. Somebody starts out with you people, and I'm probably gonna have a hard time hearing the next thing they say. I don't see color, another hot button. Do I have to teach this person? Do they know what they're saying? Are they too defensive? Do I even want to try? One last example I want to give you, but hopefully this is making you think of your hot buttons. I was taking a course. I paid money to take this course. And the woman kept saying, every time we came back from our break, she'd say, I'm sorry, I'm just a Nazi when it comes to time. And every time she said the word Nazi, I got a lump in my throat. I got a pain in the pit of my stomach. I got angry. I didn't know what to do. Hot button, big time hot button. Okay. For me, that's a hot button because I had just walked the streets of Dachau holding hands with my Jewish friend from Massachusetts and my Polish friend who had escaped Poland and grew up in Venezuela. I'm holding hands with them. So when this woman said, I'm just a Nazi when it comes to time, I was back there. That's my past experience that made this hard. When I finally told her this, well, and what happens is I paid money to go to this workshop and I can't hear anything she's saying after that. I'm losing out because of my hot button. When I said something about why are you using that term? She says, well, you know, the soup Nazi. And what I realized that in that moment, that was something funny from a show called Seinfeld to her. That was her intent. But the impact for me was so strong. I personally almost lost out on anything that she had to say from her expertise because she didn't have mine. And I want to stop there and just see if any of you, and by the way, it is another worksheet. If you can just think about any hot buttons that you have and write them down, because it tips you off when you're in a conflict that you are going to have trouble hearing the next thing. So just give me some hot buttons or write them in the chat.
Francis. Okay.
Yes.
Like the hot button you have for I don't see color. But they brought up something for me that there used to be this slogan that a lot of people ran around Eugene and other places with T-shirts that said, love, see no color. And that just, it would just set me off for some reason, because I was like, you know, no, everybody sees color, you know, unless you're trying. But we all see color. We all see physical differences, and to say that, you know, you don't have prejudice or that relationship or experience, it kind of just it turns me off. And so I think those are kind of patronizing messages to just basically tell you that, no, I'm really not a racist, but, you know, I have people in my family that are Mexican or African American or whatever the case may be. And I would tell someone, I said, it doesn't mean that you don't have the same issues that you always had. You didn't just miraculously wake up in the morning and your racism or your prejudice just disappeared because you put on a T-shirt. You know, those are some of the things that what a hot buttons to get to me.
Right, and I see some more in the chat room. I want to thank you for those too.
Or
So,
here's
go ahead.
another. I used to experience this more when I first came to Oregon than any other place I'd ever been. And I was on a phone call with this white man. And at the end of the call, he said, well, you know what? You don't even sound black. And I'm like, and so how am I supposed to sound to align myself with your image of how black people are supposed to be?
So the frustration, yeah, so, okay, so if we were in a real classroom, I would ask whoever said, I don't see color, to just paraphrase the impact it had on Greg. And you said it eloquently, and you talked about why that hurt. And then the other question is, what do we think was the intent of that? And we have to give space for people to say, here was my intent. And I think, I'm gonna guess, since I don't want to put anybody on the spot here that said it, I don't see color is, I'm not racist, don't judge me, I'm on your side. And you think of all the positive intent that they had, and then you can say, that was my hot button, it made me so mad I don't want to work with you, but maybe let's peel that back and let me see if I can help you say something where the intent and the impact match, which would probably be, I don't think I'm racist, but help me out here, or I am on your side and I want to know how to do that, but I don't see color, the intent and the impact aren't matching. So again, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see these later on. I did this recently and I had a couple people go, I'm finding all my hot buttons today. And when I walk into a conflict now and somebody does a hot button, I'm better prepared for it because I've written these down. Next slide. So I just want to make mention of these, write this down, copy this down, or just remember Harvard implicit studies. My one word of caution is that if you think you're going to do this for 10 or 15 minutes, I actually stayed up all night doing these. Basically, it's a self-test that you give yourself and it comes back. One is on race, another one on religion, on sizeism, and you're pushing two buttons and it's a forced choice and it comes out if you're slightly more pro-white than African-American, if you're more pro one religion than another, and it gives you a sliding scale. This is for internal work. And some people are willing to share them out loud. Other people, my advice is, you don't need to do this to share it with other people. It's for you to learn where your work is. Next. So microaggressions are like the ones we were talking about earlier, everyday insults, indignities, demeaning messages sent by well-intentioned members of the majority. So these are a little bit like implicit bias kinds of activities, things that we get. And maybe when you are the receiver of these microaggressions, I like to say, so what did you do? And sometimes people say, I didn't think of anything to say till I got back in my car. They're small. Or you may think it was a microaggression, but to me it was a macroaggression. It's things that happen every day, like a steady drip of water on your head. It's not the big ones. It's the steady drips of water that just keep hurting, and by the end of the day, you are exhausted. Think about when you've been the receiver and also when you may have been the deliverer of these, and what might be some of your recovery skills. Because on the other side of microaggressions, what we have is...
Francis, I think Phil wanted to say something.
Oh, go ahead, Phil.
I just want to add a real fast story. When I was in school, I was collecting cans to try and make a little extra money. So I had all these clean cans. I was bringing them into the store. And on my way there, I picked up some dirty ones on the street. I figured, here's a couple more. So I brought them into the store, and I had not taken a shower. My hair was greasy, and being multiracial, the guy looked at me and assumed I was a Latino, said, Pedro, get out of here. And he pushed me and my cans out the window, out the door. And it hit me on so many levels because I had never thought of myself as being Latino. I mean, I speak some Spanish, but I saw at that moment just how I was treated in a way. This person, I guess it wasn't even a micro, it was pretty much a macroaggression at that point. But there's ways in which people make certain assumptions and just go ahead and act on it. And even using the word, hey, Pedro, sends a message that I should feel ashamed of myself because I'm a Latino. And he said, get those dirty cans out of here. So maybe he was assuming. So there's ways in which people send these messages. In some ways, they're more micro, some ways more macro. And luckily, I went back, put my suit on, and filed a complaint against the guy and got him fired. But I'm still, these happen every day, and sometimes you don't see them. Or now that you've had this workshop, hopefully everybody will think about it a little more, because maybe some of them are happening to people around you, even if they're not happening to you specifically.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is where I have a hard time with microaggressions, because like, what makes them micro? And I almost want to say, and maybe others could think about this or we could talk about it later, but I think if it's a microaggression, you can't really tell the story. Like, it's so subtle that you can't tell the story, because every time we start to tell the story, we go, wait, maybe that was a macroaggression. And I also think that it's the person who receives it is the one who has to decide, because it's small, or it's small for you. Maybe it was big for you because it was the first time you'd ever been called Pedro. And for somebody else, it's like, oh, that guy, he does it all the time. So the micro, macro, I'm not sure. The other one, and you did make me think of the story, is that at what point does it land? Because I was in a class that maybe I was probably one of 2 Latinos in this music class in the 5th grade. And I remember that I always felt horrible. And I hung out with these 3 girls. I almost gave a stereotype here. These 3 girls who were very popular. And it wasn't until I was in grad school doing this work that it hit me that the music teacher didn't like me because I was Mexican. So is that a micro because it took me so long? Was it that I had to have a cumulative piece to do this? And there's lots of evidence to it now, but at the time, I really liked her and I wanted her to like me, and I liked music and all of those things. So micro, macro, the point I think here is that we understand that we all do it, that it may seem small, it could be bigger, and that we know that we need to be called on it, and we also need to be aware that it's happening. The other side of microaggressions, next slide. Can there be microaffirmations? Because I think we spend a lot of time talking about all the things we're doing wrong. are there ways that we can do micro affirmations? And in the research, I found this amazing article, next slide, written for Brown University, I believe, and it was actually talking to the professors, which is why I think this is such a great one to bring in here, about how to do micro affirmations in your class. And active listening is not listening for the point that you were going to make. It's listening because you don't know their shoes. You've never walked in their shoes. You couldn't possibly. Let them talk in a way where you are listening for content, for feeling, for their point of view. Recognizing and validating experiences, not saying, well, maybe he didn't mean that. I had one the other day, and I'm telling a colleague who also knows this man something that he said to me that was so hurtful. And her response was, oh, I don't think he meant it that way. You totally invalidated my experience. You also made me feel like I'm horrible for being hurt. So there's non-affirmation of my emotional reaction. She may in fact be right, but the impact on me was painful. And she totally discounted that and went right to the intent. As teachers, when you have students from all of these different places, here are ways that you can do micro affirmations. Next. So a very wise man from Lane Community College, while we were doing a seminar, said, the solution must be good for you and others. Can we raise the bar to its highest point that says, the only way this is good is if it is good for all? And I really had to think about it. I wrote to James. We talked about why I wanted to use this. And at first, my first hit was, oh, so now those people who've marginalized me, it has to be good for them too? Well, I'm going to argue that we're all marginalized in some way. And this next quote that I love is from an article called So You Want to Talk About Race. Actually, she also wrote a book. When we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change. And this, with James Garcia's comment, gives me where I need to go when I'm in conflict with a person, or I am standing with an organization that is not letting us work together so that all of us benefit. Next one. So the last piece we need to look at is systemic. And next page there. This is, as I understand it from my research, the original statement of systemic racism. And he focused pretty much just on race. It includes the complex array of anti-Black practices, which we could say anti-marginalized people, unjustly gained political economic power of whites, continuing economic and other resource inequalities, advancing white racist ideologies that rationalize white privilege and power. Here it means that the core racist realities are manifested in each of society's major parts. And then we look at these: economic, political, educational, religion, and family. We look at systemic racism. So next slide is the video. Comments, reactions?
Yeah, I thought that was a very good depiction of some of the issues that people are facing. I play a game in one of my classes where people get chips, and everybody thinks they're getting the same colored chips, and I give the really good ones just to one of the three groups, and talk to them about how when you get an advantage as a young person, when you have just something as simple as your inheritance, it makes a big difference on how far you can go. So this is really a fabulous discussion starter, looking at some of the barriers. You know, not everybody faces every one of the barriers, but many people do face them as communities and within families, I would say.
So that tells us, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Francis, that really kind of clearly illustrates a lot of the things that, African Americans and Latinos face in this society, specifically when you start talking about poor schooling, most of us have gone to public schools. There's been a divestment in public education. So the best, you don't get to have access to the best schooling unless you can pay for it. Healthcare, the same way. I consider myself lucky to have a job with, health benefits. Most of the people I know, a lot of people I grew up with, don't have health care benefits. There's a woman that we had gone to school since we were in the first grade, and she died recently. And her daughter sent out one of those fundraising messages on Facebook, and it was for two things. One, to pay the cost of her hospice and hospital bill, but also she didn't have any money to bury her mother with, and that was pretty telling, because that's what a lot of African Americans face every day is those kind of choices or those kinds of situations where no, you only make so much and you don't have enough money to afford health insurance, let alone a death insurance policy that would put you in the ground and bury you. So yeah, this was a great illustration.
Thank you. That was a painful story, Greg. Whew. So systemically, we know that it's an uneven playing field for people of color, for marginalized people. So next slide. So what it does for the dominant culture is that there becomes a privilege. And I want to say there are 14 different cultural categories. We have privilege in some. We don't always have privileged and non-privileged. There are different parts of that I personally feel privileged, and there are other parts that I don't. So privilege, the definition, unearned social power accorded by the formal and informal institutions of society to the members of the dominant group. And because of that, we have a little video, the second and only the last video, that explains a little bit about privilege. Reactions, comments?
Yeah, I thought it was a very good capsule summary of some of the very difficult issues, because too often you hear somebody say, well, what about Obama? He was the president, so everything's all solved. And I think it's easy to just point at one woman, one African American, and just think everything's totally good. And by bringing in that history, pointing out some of the bigger issues, again, you can't understand every Jamal you meet or every Kevin you meet, but it helps to move the story away from just Jamal and just Kevin. So I think it was a very valuable tool.
Thank you. Okay, what's the next one?
Oh, Francis?
Yes, move it back, Amanda, so we don't read ahead. Go ahead, Greg.
I was going to say, I recall, this was before I was born, but the year before I was born, my parents were looking to buy a house, and they eventually bought the house that I grew up in, but they could not get a bank loan. In fact, pretty much every African American who bought a house on our block or even in the neighborhood got their loans from savings and loans. And savings and loans no longer exist, but that was the primary vehicle to get a mortgage if you were African American, because places like Cleveland Trust and Society National, they would laugh at you if you walked in ask for a loan, even though both of my parents were fairly well employed. My father worked for the post office, and my mother was a teacher. So they had the income to service the debt. So it's not something that, banks did in those days, and it was hard to even get insurance on your house. So, yeah, I'm well aware of all of that.
And the hard thing is to recognize when it's happening in our society and maybe even within our own institutions. And so again, I have to applaud Lane Community College for even taking a look at this and running the risk of being able to uncover all of the things that are going on, whether we do it on purpose or not, and start looking at how we start solving the problem. So next. So this, believe it or not, back in 2000, when I was teaching this as a graduate course for teachers, I found this little summary that I used to do for them. And I thought it was useful since most of you are employees at Lane Community College. Things we need to remember about culture. Culture is at work in every classroom. It is a means of survival. They may all look like they come from the same culture, but as we started out, there are 14 different cultural categories. They are all very different, each student that's in that room. And we learn our cultures, we learn that web, we learn that blanket as a means of survival. It is a good thing to us. Culture affects the organization of learning, development of school rules and curriculum, implementation of teaching methods and evaluation procedures. What we decide an A to an F means, what we decide is how we organize the day, if it's 3 hours a week, once a week, versus a weekend seminar. What kinds of teaching methods we use. If we're evaluating the professor or are we evaluating the work, we teach just as much by what we choose to leave out of our curriculum as by what we choose to put in. Culture can help solve problems and conflicts within the school community if we stop being afraid of it and we look at these things and we listen to the heartfelt stories that we've heard today from Phil and Greg and Tracy and Amanda. We can start solving it, but we have to be willing to look at it from these cultural lenses. And as Lane Community College, what can your school do? It can actually help prepare the students for more effective cultural citizenship, because all of us, every single person in the room, all people are cultural beings. And I'd like to, before we do our final closing, I'd like to stop, no, go ahead. I'd like to just ask, sit back and think about what we've done. Are you ready to take off? Are you ready to do your part? And I'd like to hear at least 3 responses. 3 things you learned or relearned today while going through this presentation. Something you learned or were reminded of. I'm not signing off till I get 3. Make them up. We have to put this in the presentation. Go, Phil. Thanks for rescuing me.
Just being reminded how sometimes the microaggressions can also be macroaggressions, and looking at how things affect other people and affect, I wasn't used to being treated that way, but it allowed me to see how my Latino sisters and brothers were being treated. And you reminded me of that, and that's really important, because if you're going to be part of the systemic change, you have to be able to step into somebody else's way of seeing the world. And so that was, I thought, very good.
Thank you. Someone else? Thank you.
I'll go. Yeah, I learned a little bit more about the intersectionality. That's always been a big word for me, and I think of it in a couple different ways based on my past experiences, especially with like art history. But in this context, yeah, just seeing how everything can kind of come together and they can overlap and that you are part of all of it and how they can, you know, sort of interrelate to one another, I found was fascinating, and to constantly remember that.
Thank you. Greg.
Oh yeah. One of the things that I learned or I relearned was um, the real life effect of systemic racism, and that it reminded me of a conversation I had a couple of weeks back with a white colleague in another area, where this guy just tells me that he doesn't believe that institutional racism exists. And I just started going down this whole litany of how there is such a gap between, how white males live in this country versus white women versus men of color versus women of color. And it just kind of underscored for me that whole point, because if a white male is making the full dollar, you also have to realize that white women are only making 71 cents per dollar. Black women are at the bottom, which they make 54 cents per dollar. So the disparities are really, underscored by the institutionalization of racism, and the way that it looks. If you look at all the markers that are out there, that's not going to change soon, even with a Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot of things socially, institutionally, and systemically that have to change, and that's going to be a difficult lift.
Thank you. Thank you. Things that, and I'm going to change this, 2 ways I can help others learn. How do you take what we did here and help other people learn this? We'll take a couple of answers.
I like to think about the hot buttons and thinking about what are the things that are hot buttons for you personally. And then, as you process those, you start to think about things that might be hot buttons for somebody else, somebody who's a different gender from me, somebody who's different age from me, somebody who's different experience. I thought that was very useful because I'm pretty sure I know what my hot buttons are, but getting to think about what might be the hot buttons for somebody else, I think, is a very important exercise.
Thank you. And I'm going to say that the one for me it's always the one I have to work on, is listening with empathy and being able to hear somebody without judging or without thinking, gee, I just don't have that much time, or they're taking too long to tell their story, to be able to let them do it in real time. It's just one of those things that I have to relearn. Every time I teach this, I'm like, did you hear that? That's what you have to do. Anybody else?
I found the intent versus impact thing that I hadn't really thought about, trying to pursue until I knew my point had got across. I really like that idea.
Thank you. And the last one, a commitment, one thing that you will do to change or better yourself. Anybody?
Well, one of the things that I realize is that when I go through these workshops, I'm always learning something new or something from a different perspective than I've seen from it before. So, what one of the things that I have to do is to slow down, to listen intently, and to be able to reflect back, to the people that I'm talking to, the person that I'm talking to, that I'm getting what they're saying, I'm understanding what they're saying, or I'm clarifying what they're saying so that I can have a better understanding of where they are and where they're trying to go. It reminds me of my father-in-law. He was born in 1930 in Central Washington. So he didn't have a lot of experience with, people of color to begin with. So there were things that he would say to me occasionally that, were I thought were really offensive, but that wasn't his intent. And so I had to listen to him in order to learn and reflect back what I heard, and what the real intent was in terms of the message, and to not get caught up into too much of what I was feeling as the impact on me, but kind of turning that around and, kind of see things from his point of view. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think that's where I go back to Jim Garcia's comment is it's got to work for both of us. Well, I want to thank you for all of your hard work and all of your thinking and particularly all of your willingness to share this with us. And I'd like to end with a quote from a very dear friend of mine, Kathleen Sadat. Want to call her a mentor, want to call her a boxing partner. Just one of my great friends and believers, definitely in my blue circle. And Kathleen Sadat said, "I believe in coalitions. I believe that together we can change the world in a way we have never seen before." And this is a first step, this fundamental class. And I want to thank each and every one of you for helping do the heavy lift that is intercultural communication. Thank you.